Well, thank you, and it is my pleasure today to introduce our Emperor Has No Clothes Award recipient, Professor Anthony B. Pinn. Anthony Pinn grew up in the African American church, was on his way to becoming a minister, but today is a leading humanist and freethinker, serving as the Agnes Cullen Arnold Professor of Humanities at Rice University. Professor Pinn earned a BA from Columbia and a Master of Divinity and PhD in the study of religion from Harvard, is the founding director of the Center for Engaged Research and Collaborative Learning at Rice University. In addition, he is director of research for the Institute of Humanist Studies, which is a Washington, D.C. think tank. Professor Pinn has authored or edited more than 35 books, including his, most recently, his book, When Color Blindness Isn't the Answer, which he'll be signing at 3:30 directly after his talk. A few of his previous books include Religion in the Age of Obama, Humanism's Essays on Race, Religion, and Popular Culture, Religion in Hip Hop, Everyday Humanism, the Oxford Handbook of African American Theology, What is Humanism and Why Does It Matter? What Has the Black Church to Do with Public Life? End of God Talk and African American Humanist Theology, and his autobiographical story, Writing God's Obituary, How a Good Methodist Became a Better Atheist. Professor Pinn has said, quote, African American humanism says yes to humanity, the importance of vitality of black life within the context of a world conditioned to disregard blackness. It embraces certain elements of the enlightenment of the modern world and while also pointing out the manner in which modernity also entails deep damage and disregard of non-European peoples. Representing the American Humanist Association at the 2016 Reason Rally in DC, Dr. Pinn noted that America, quote, is a country that too often dismisses people who don't believe in ghosts, who don't reject evolution, who don't pray for change, rather than rolling up their sleeves and doing what they can do through creativity, compassion, and hard work. Very inspiring words from a man who does embody the small child in the fairy tale who tells it like it is about religion. Please come up, Tony, and get your award. Behind me. Put it facing this way.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I am delighted to be here with you. You'll forgive me for first doing a shout out because I have family here, not family by blood, but family by bond. My sister Mandisa Thomas, she is doing the work, isn't she? And Jeremiah Kamara, I just had the pleasure of meeting my brother not that long ago, but I am so honored to have been a part of his project. It was a thrill. I'm also deeply honored and grateful to be a part of this outstanding group of honorees. I don't know that I deserve it, but I'll take it. The work being done by the Freedom from Religion Foundation for me is extremely important. And I say this as one who is by disposition an atheist and by practice a humanist, but an odd creature in that, despite that, I study religion. And I study religion not to belittle it, but I take it seriously. Why? because it is a cultural force that over the course of centuries has determined how we understand life, what we appreciate as meaningful. And I appreciate the work done by this foundation in large part because it calls to task the type of influence theism tries to demonstrate within the public arena. Forget what takes place on Sunday, Monday through Saturday, the effort of theism to influence what we can do and how we can perceive ourselves. Think about it this way. There are ways in which theism is a parasite. It infects and it influences. And we have recent examples of this. I don't know your politics, but for the next half an hour, it really doesn't matter. We live within the context of a social world in which truth no longer matters. Facts are irrelevant. And for people who look like me, there is something extra pernicious in the Make America Great Again claim. We've heard this before. We've felt this before. It is a thin veil for a rabid populism and a bizarre sense of whiteness that masquerades as nationalism that does extreme harm. It understands difference as a problem that has to be addressed in a way that does it in. And religion works to safeguard this. Theism works in a way that provides a moral and ethical rationale for this sort of behavior, but this is not new. This work of religion allowed a justification of the slave trade. It provided a justification for the wiping out of native populations. It provides a rationale and a justification for keeping small brown children in cages and arguing that toothbrushes and showers are luxuries. It provides a rationale, a justification for assuming that we live within the context of a nation that has to be protected through strong barriers that amount to a physical disregard for difference. This is not new. And again, religion undergirds this. Theism provides a justification for this sort of behavior, and it needs to be tackled. It has to be recognized and called to task. And so on one level, I understand what I say, what I do, and what I write as an effort to decrease the public harm that theism does. I'm not trying to close churches, mosques, and synagogues. What you want to do on Friday, Saturday, Sunday, that is your personal business. But the public arena, public space should not be restricted, should not be strangled by the theological claims and wishes of any particular population. It's bigger than that. It's more robust than that. It requires a grammar and a language of life that allows us to live out our best ideals. It requires a grammar and language of life that allows us to take seriously what Thoreau tried to teach us to do, to live deliberately, so that at the end we what? Know that we have lived. We need a grammar, we need a vocabulary of public life that allows us, again, in the vein of Thoreau, to suck the marrow out of life, to take all that we can out of life, to allow for a robust existence that is available to all. It allows us, this grammar, this vocabulary that shapes our moral and ethical vision, allows us to stand with Thoreau, who says, I will not support through my finances a country that belittles and enslaves. And so from his jail cell, he looks out at his friend Emerson, and Emerson wants to know, what you doing in there? And Thoreau's response is, the better question is, what are you doing out there? To live life deliberately, we need a grammar, a vocabulary, a language of life that will allow us to honor what my grandmother told me before she sent me to New York. Walk through the world knowing your footsteps matter. And for my grandmother, this wasn't a way of telling little Tony that you got to get all that you can. It wasn't her way of saying that This education is about your personal well-being. This was not her way of saying that this education is about you securing a middle-class existence. For my grandmother, Annie Hargrave, it was bigger than that. The idea was simply this: you have an obligation to do beyond yourself, that you measure your success not through your own acquisition, but the ways in which your efforts, your conversation, your doing helps even a little bit, helps someone else have a healthier existence. Walk through the world knowing your footsteps matter, and we need a grammar and vocabulary of life that will allow us to achieve this. And maintaining, critiquing, being dedicated to making certain that theism doesn't rule the public arena is a huge element of that. But here's the catch for me. While separation of state church is vital, and I will always, always applaud that work, I'm not quite convinced that even a more perfect application of state church separation would have kept Trayvon Martin alive, would have kept Sandra Bland alive, would have changed the life options and reduced the violence that trans folks encounter. And so for me, it's a recognition that theism needs to be challenged when it enters the public arena, but the other half of my obligation in what I say, what I do, and what I write is to decrease the harm that free thought, humanism, and atheism do in the world. Pause. Think about it this way. I have not encountered very many free thinkers, humanists, or atheists who don't embrace Thomas Jefferson. Yeah? I've encountered very few who don't embrace Thomas Jefferson. But here's the catch. In embracing Thomas Jefferson, you are also embracing a legacy of sexual violence and racial disregard. And so the question for me is this: does humanism, does atheism, does free thought matter in the 21st century? Does it provide a way forward? Does it provide a moral and ethical posture towards the world that allows us to advance life, to celebrate its beauty and all of its diversity? And I will today and always say, it cannot and it does not, if it doesn't understand as central to its mission, social justice. Look at me and see someone who comes from a long legacy of folks for whom the challenges of existence, the demonizing of life extends well beyond separation of church and state and science education. It has something to do with the deep disregard for blackness and the ever-present celebration of whiteness. And so from this day forward, I encourage you, don't say people of color anymore. And I say that because that category, people of color, leaves unchallenged whiteness as normative, because the implication is there is white and everybody else. If you can't get rid of that language altogether, then perhaps a slight modification. People of a despised color. Part of our obligation is to rethink ourselves on the individual level, on the level of our community, on the level of our organization, so that our ethical impulse, the mission of our organizations, is so tied to social justice that if we are not doing something about social justice, we have failed as organizations. That this is not an add-on, this is central to who we are and what we do. It says something about the human and our humanism. It says something about those we are thinking about in our free thought. If we're not doing this well, we have failed. Social justice has to be central. But how do we get there? Just quickly, because I wanted to save a little time for us to have a conversation, yes, to chat a bit. I just want to highlight a few things. One, it requires recognizing that simply because you are new to the presence of black and brown humanists, free thinkers, and atheists doesn't mean that we have just come on the scene. You've just been slow. And so when you think about humanism and free thought and atheism within the context of the United States, you cannot understand it properly if you are not taking into consideration how these traditions live within communities that are brown and black. You are missing something, because we've been here. We've been doing this. Another thing to keep in mind is there are some complexities in terms of black and brown folks who remain within theistic communities. And rather than asking me and other folks like me, why are black people still in the church? Why are brown people still in the church? The better question is this: why haven't we done something that is so compelling that they want to be with us? I will quickly give you a sense of why so many African Americans, at least, remain in church. And it has nothing to do with buying the theology provided by that pastor. Think in terms of the black middle class. After the civil rights movement, theism within the United States begins to decline. This is not simply black churches, but churches by and large experience a decline. It's not until the 1980s that black folks begin to come back to these churches in large numbers. Why? They played by the rules. You told us, don't code switch, speak like us, and you'll do better. You said, go to these schools and you'll have opportunities. You said, live in these neighborhoods and you'll have opportunities. And we played by those rules and still hit racism. And not only did we hit racism, but in this process, we had given something up of our cultural heritage, our connections. And so 1980s, folks began to go back to these black churches, not because, again, they did not necessarily buy the theology. They weren't looking for soul salvation, but social networking, cultural connections, economic opportunities, a space in which they could catch their breath and not have to explain to anybody why they were angry. When you talk in terms of the black church, you also have to talk in terms of Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, Gabriel Prosser, Henry McNeil Turner, Jarena Lee, Ida B. Wells, right? Henry McNeil Turner argues in 1895 in Atlanta, Georgia, that God is a Negro. I don't imagine that's the black religion you have in mind, is it? Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, Gabriel Prosser argued that the worth of blacks, the deep value of blacks is such that if it requires the slaughter of whites in order to celebrate it, so be it. That's probably not the kind of black church you're critiquing, is it? So it's complex. I'm simply saying it's complex. And rather than pointing the finger at the folks in the church, we need to point the finger at ourselves and ask, why aren't we doing something that is so compelling they can't help but join us? Next, do some homework. We are a community that prides itself on being informed. We read. But when it comes to issues of diversity, we want to rely on ignorance and the goodwill of those who don't look like us. Pick up a book. Read. Learn. Finally, if you're really interested in diversity, if we're going to do this social justice thing right, and we are going to do it in a way that fundamentally changes our organizations, changes our communities, then it requires discomfort. You can't make change and be comfortable. So rather than understanding discomfort as a problem that has to be solved, that you've got to reach equilibrium again, understand discomfort as an opportunity. Your mind being opened up for new ways of thinking, new ways of doing, new ways of communicating. It seems to me this is our obligation. If we are convinced that the only thing that can alter the circumstances of life in the United States and beyond, if we are convinced that it requires the material effort of those like us, let's recognize a deeper obligation to appreciate, to celebrate, to be uncomfortable in our effort to secure a type of diversity that represents us and defines a new type of possibility for living. Thank you. I see that the light is still green, so let's have at it before it turns yellow. Okay.
Hi.
Hey, I see you.
Thank you for being here. I'm curious about your opinion of a black judge offering forgiveness to a white cop who gunned down a black man in cold blood.
Yeah. I understand why, but for me it points to a problem. One, that forgiveness, from my vantage point, requires a recognition of wrongdoing and an effort to correct that wrongdoing. I did not sense that. And so it cheapens forgiveness. Forgiveness ought to be premised upon a demonstration of accountability and responsibility, and I did not see that.
Thank you.
So I have to admit, I just bought your book, and I was just skimming the differences. I like to go to the end to see what you offer. And I'm terrified of white nationalists. Ever since Trump was elected, I've been thinking about myself being in a concentration camp. And I'm a psychiatrist. I have patients. I swear I'm getting to a question. I have patients who tell me things like, oh, my dream is to teach people to speak, the kind of coded stuff. And I feel like, as you being a professor, me being a doctor, we're the elite. And anything we say or do, it's like there's a wall.
I'm going to ask you to get to the question.
Here comes the question. How on earth do we penetrate that wall? We can speak to each other this way. We can think amongst ourselves. We can read. But how do we talk and listen in a way that leads to productive talk?
One, I'll say two things on this quickly. One, we have to recognize, attempt to recognize why people hold positions, right? Appreciate their context, appreciate the dynamics of their life experience, right? Try to understand where they are. Secondly, and for me, this is fundamental for folks who don't believe that there is divine assistance, that rather than outcome-driven strategies, we ought to have process-driven strategies. We cannot guarantee anything will improve. We are not saying God is on the throne and all is well. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. We don't know this. We know that what we can do is try. So rather than outcome-driven strategies, we ought to follow what Albert Camus outlines when he talks about Sisyphus. You're familiar with Sisyphus, right? This is the dude who's being punished by the gods, and this punishment involves rolling this rock up a hill that only comes back down. And what Camus wants us to understand about that is that perpetual effort doesn't have to break you. That rather than fixating on the end, the outcome, celebrate, recognize the importance, the value in the struggle. Recognize that there is something freeing, something liberating in saying no to injustice. And perhaps all we can hope for, all we can do is make certain that we are loud and persistent in that saying no.
So very specifically,
Okay.
So very specifically, my question to you is, how would you change some of the policies that we have right now? Give me some specific policy suggestions to change some of the laws and legal provisions of this
Well, you
country.
got to give me a particular topic. I mean, this policies, that's rather
How do we
broad.
celebrate in terms of very specific, like, you know, I mean, give me a legislation suggestion that I can go to my congressman and say, here, bring about this legal, legal change, this legislative change that will help us move one step in that direction that you're suggesting.
I'll go back to something that was that's in Jeremiah's movie, that one of the things that was of vital importance to me, there are lots of religious organizations with which I'm familiar that understand themselves to be concerned with poverty and the transformation of communities. Yes, and again, it seems to me one way to get at that is not to ask for extra money, but a proper use of existing money. So pay your property taxes. Right? Organizations that are committed to this, black churches that are committed to rethinking the economic plight of their communities could do this by saying, we don't care what the federal government is saying. We have an obligation to make a difference in this money that we would give in property taxes within the county. We are going to give. Yeah, that we may not be legally obligated to do it, but we understand that this is our responsibility, this is our obligation. And rather than trying to determine politics in the public space, use this money to transform the neighborhoods in which your churches reside. I think you have the last one.
I was talking with my friend about all these problems I was having and how I'm heads down on news because I can't deal with it. And she pointed out that that's white privilege. And for me, it was really impactful because I thought, she's right. And can you speak a bit about recognizing white privilege in your own life?
First order of business is this is not guesswork. If you are recognized as white within the context of the United States, you have privilege. Period. I could drop the mic with that, right? That if you are white in the United States, you have privilege. And it comes across in a variety of ways. One, white privilege authorizes you to feel comfortable and confident that you are right in occupying time and space, that your living room, enjoying your living room will not result in your death, that walking down the street will not result in your death. Think about it in simple ways, right? I'll give you one example. If you go to a restaurant and they seat you near the restroom and you're not thinking, what the hell, why'd you put, right? You're not thinking, well, what's up with this? Why did they put me here? Then you probably have a form of privilege, right? Or if you go and buy a car and the consideration is simply, what can I afford to drive? And you don't have to consider what kind of police interest will this vehicle get me, you probably have privilege. Thanks so much.